The sun hung heavy and stagnant over the dusty perimeter of the Wyoming territory, casting long, bruised shadows across the dry-packed earth of the homestead. Clara moved with a rhythmic, mechanical efficiency that had become her only defense against the crushing weight of the chores. Her hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 manual tasks, gripped the handle of a heavy feed sack as she crossed the interior of the sagging barn. Jasper, a lean German shepherd with eyes the color of scorched amber, trotted at her heels, his tail low and his nose twitching at the scent of stale hay and old leather. The barn was a skeletal structure, built with more hope than skill by her late husband, and it groaned under the weight of its own history. As Clara stepped near the back corner where the shadows pooled like spilled ink, her boot didn't meet the expected resistance of the floorboards. There was a sickening, splintering crack, a sound like a rifle shot in the confined space, and the earth simply vanished beneath her left leg. She tumbled forward, the feed sack bursting and spraying golden grain across the dark wood as she caught herself on a support beam, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Jasper began a frantic, low-pitched barking, his hackles rising as he circled the jagged hole that had appeared in the floor. Clara pulled her leg free, gasping at the sharp sting of a splinter, and peered into the darkness below. It wasn't just a localized rot in the timber. Below the broken planks lay a void, a structured cavity that smelled not of damp decay, but of cool, ancient stone and dry earth. She reached for the lantern hanging from a nearby nail, her hands trembling as she struck a match. The flame flickered to life, casting a jittery amber glow into the depths. This was no natural subsidence. Someone had been digging here long ago, creating a space that had been meticulously concealed and then forgotten. "Stay back, Jasper," she whispered, her voice sounding thin and metallic in the empty barn. The dog whined, pacing the perimeter of the breach as if sensing the weight of the secret that had just been unmasked. Clara knelt at the edge of the opening, the lantern held low so the light could spill into the subterranean chamber. The descent was shallow, perhaps 6 feet, revealing a room that had been roughly hewn into the hard-packed clay and then lined with crude, unfinished cedar planks. This was the work of Miller, the man who had owned this claim before her husband had bought it at a desperate discount. Miller had been a specter in the local law, a man who lived in total isolation and spoke to no one, eventually vanishing into the mountains and leaving behind a reputation for hoarding and a profound, selfish secrecy. As Clara lowered herself into the hole, the temperature dropped instantly, but it wasn't the biting, aggressive chill of the surface. It was a stable, heavy coolness that felt like a shield. She walked the perimeter, her boots echoing softly on the dirt floor. Miller had been methodical. He had created a space approximately 12 feet by 12 feet, shored up with heavy beams that showed no signs of any decorative flourishes. These were functional, brutalist supports. She found a small, rusted iron stove in the corner, its flue disappearing into a cleverly hidden vent that must have exited through the barn's foundation. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Miller hadn't just built a cellar for storage, he had built a fortress against the elements, a place where a man could survive the legendary winters of the plains while his neighbors struggled in drafty cabins. It was a masterpiece of hidden engineering, born of a desire to survive alone while the rest of the world froze. She looked up at the light filtering through the broken floorboards and murmured, "He kept this for himself while the blizzards took the livestock and the children in the valley." The dog let out a soft whine from above, his head cocked in confusion, peering down at her as if she had been swallowed by the very land they walked upon. "It is cold up there, but it is safe down here," she added, trailing her fingers along the rough-hewn wood that smelled faintly of mountain resin and old earth. The next morning, Clara did not set out to mend the barn floor in the traditional sense. Instead, she began the grueling, systematic process of expansion and reinforcement. She called her son, Silas, a quiet boy of 9 with his father's steady eyes and a frame that was beginning to fill out with the lean muscle of a farmhand, and showed him the hidden room. "Silas, we have a way to stay warm this year," she told him, her voice firm with a new, sharp purpose that the boy hadn't heard since the funeral. The boy looked at the dark square in the floor and then back at his mother, his expression one of cautious wonder. "Does the earth stay warm, Mother?" he asked, reaching out to touch the cool cedar lining that felt like skin against his fingertips. Clara nodded, explaining the principles of thermal mass in the simple, practical language of the frontier. "The ground doesn't care about the frost on the grass, Silas. If we go deep enough, we can live in the heart of the world where the wind can't find us. They spent the following weeks in a blur of motion. Clara used a heavy pickaxe to widen the chamber, the strikes vibrating through her shoulders and teeth. Silas hauled the excavated dirt out in small buckets, dumping it behind the barn where the neighbors couldn't see the growing mound. They worked in the dim light of the lantern, their breathing the only sound in the quiet earth. Clara sourced local pine and thick oak planks from an old fence line, measuring and cutting them with a handsaw to reinforce the walls further. She avoided any flourishes, focusing entirely on the structural integrity. "Are we like the prairie dogs, Mother?" Silas asked one afternoon as he wiped a streak of gray clay from his forehead. Clara smiled tightly, noting that the prairie dogs were often the only ones who didn't go hungry when the snow piled high. "We are exactly like them, Silas," she replied. "We are building a sanctuary where the world cannot reach us." The sound of a horse's hooves on the dry approach signaled the arrival of Mr. Henderson, a neighbor whose primary occupation seemed to be the cataloging of other people's failures and the spreading of pessimistic gossip. He pulled his mount to a halt near the barn, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Silas hauling another bucket of dirt toward the back of the property. Clara stepped out from the shadows of the barn, wiping sweat and grime from her forehead with the back of her hand. Henderson leaned forward in his saddle, a look of amused pity on his weathered face. "I heard a rumor you were digging a hole big enough to swallow your whole livelihood, Clara," he said, his voice carrying the effortless condescension of a man who owned 3 healthy oxen and a house with double-thick walls. "Some of the folks in town are saying you finally lost your mind to the isolation. Are you digging a grave for that old barn, or just looking for gold that isn't there?" Clara stood her ground, her silhouette framed by the weathered timber of the barn door. "It is just a matter of foundation work, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her tone clipped and devoid of any invitation for further inquiry. "The barn has been settling, and I intend to see it stand through the season." Henderson laughed, a dry, rattling sound that lacked any real warmth. "You're a widow with a boy and a dog, Clara. You should be spending your strength on cordwood and tallow, not playing in the dirt like a child," he remarked, shaking his head. "This winter is going to be a hard one. I can feel it in my joints. If you spend all your time under the floor, you'll be the first one the spring thaw finds." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air like a taunt. Clara watched him go, feeling the weight of the community's skepticism. "Let them laugh while they have the breath to do it," she whispered to Jasper, who growled low in his throat. By the time the first true frost arrived, the dugout was complete. It was a subterranean cabin lined entirely with thick, interlocking planks of wood that Clara had sanded smooth by hand using rough stones and patience. The iron stove had been cleaned and tested, its heat radiating outward and being absorbed by the cool earth walls, creating a steady, enveloping warmth that the cabin above could never match. The transition happened on a Tuesday, when the thermometer on the porch dropped 20 degrees in a single hour. The air turned a sharp, brittle blue, and the birds vanished from the sky as if pulled away by an invisible hand. Clara packed their bedding, the heavy cast iron pots, and their meager supply of salted meat. "We move tonight, Silas," she said as the light began to fail. The boy didn't argue, he had seen the way the water in the bucket on the porch had frozen solid in minutes. He led Jasper down the new wooden stairs she had built, the dog sniffing the air with a sense of guarded approval. They settled into the earth as the first crystals of ice began to bloom on the troughs outside. The cabin above them groaned as the cold began to shrink its joints, the thin walls offering no resistance to the creeping freeze. But in the dugout, the temperature remained a constant, defiant 50 degrees even without a fire. Clara lit a small bundle of kindling in the stove, watching the flames dance behind the iron door. "Is the wind gone, Mother?" Silas asked, looking up at the ceiling where the heavy barn floor acted as their sky. "It is still there, Silas," Clara answered, "but it doesn't belong to us anymore." The contrast was absolute. Above them, the world was becoming a graveyard of ice. Below, they were wrapped in the ancient, silent protection of the soil. Jasper curled at the foot of the bed, his breathing slow and rhythmic as the heat from the stove began to fill the wooden room. The blizzard arrived not as a guest, but as a conqueror, turning the Wyoming plains into a featureless void of white fury. Within 48 hours, the barn above the dugout had become a mountain of drifted snow, its structural integrity tested by the weight of several tons of frozen water. Down in the subterranean chamber, the sound of the storm was reduced to a low, rhythmic hum, like the vibration of a distant hive. Clara sat by the iron stove, her fingers moving rhythmically as she checked the tension of the heavy cedar planks she had braced against the eastern wall. She knew the physics of their survival depended on the integrity of the air intake, a simple iron pipe that she had run through the barn's foundation, shielded by a heavy wooden cowl. Every few hours, she would climb the ladder to ensure the pipe hadn't been choked by the drifting powder. It was a methodical, dangerous dance. Silas watched her with wide eyes as she prepared for another ascent into the crawl space just beneath the barn floor. "Mother, the dog won't stop pacing the stairs," the boy noted, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the kindling. Jasper was indeed restless, his ears pricked toward the ceiling where the heavy timbers of the barn were beginning to protest under the atmospheric pressure. Clara patted the dog's head, feeling the static electricity in his fur. "The animals know when the world is changing, Silas," she told him. "We just have to be smarter than the change. If that pipe freezes, the air stays still, and we can't have that." She climbed the ladder and peered through the gaps in the trapdoor. The barn was a cavern of frost, the air so cold it felt like inhaling needles. She could see that the main doors had been braced shut by a massive drift, effectively sealing them into their wooden cocoon. "It is a wall of white out there," she whispered to herself. It was a terrifying realization for any other homesteader, but for Clara, it was a confirmation of her design. They were insulated by the very element that sought to destroy them. The third day of the storm brought a silence that was more unsettling than the wind. It was the silence of a world buried alive. Clara spent the morning teaching Silas how to regulate the stove's dampener to conserve their limited supply of dry wood. She had stocked the dugout with 3 months of fuel, but the cold was an opportunistic thief, always looking for a way to bleed their heat into the surrounding clay. They sat together on the floor, the golden light of the lantern reflecting off the smooth, unadorned surfaces of the pine walls. There was a peculiar, dry humor in their predicament that Clara found herself sharing with the boy. "Mr. Henderson is likely sitting in his parlor right now, Silas, wearing 3 coats and wondering if his toes are still attached to his feet," she remarked while she peeled a dried apple. The boy chuckled, though the sound was tight with the lingering anxiety of the situation. "He told me the earth was for the dead, Mother," Silas said, looking at the sturdy beams that held back the weight of the Wyoming territory. Clara looked at the ceiling and replied, "The earth is only for the dead if you don't know how to talk to it, Silas. For the living, it is the only thing that doesn't blow away when the sky turns mean." She spent the next few hours documenting their progress in a small ledger, noting the temperature gradients at different depths. She found that the corners of the room, furthest from the stove, remained a steady 45 degrees, a testament to the insulation provided by the thick timber lining. This wasn't just survival, it was a technical victory over a landscape that had tried to starve her out. However, the victory felt hollow in the isolation. She thought of Miller, the man who had first cut this hole into the ground. He had died alone, likely in a room just like this, surrounded by his own cleverness but lacking a single soul to share the warmth. "Do you think Miller was lonely down here?" Silas asked, as if reading her mind. "I think he was too busy being right to be lonely," Clara answered, "but being right doesn't keep the heart beating." The crisis arrived on the 4th evening in the form of a frantic, muffled thudding against the barn floor directly above their heads. Jasper erupted into a series of sharp, territorial barks, his body tensing as he leaped toward the ladder. Clara froze, her hand hovering over the lantern. Someone was in the barn, or rather, someone was attempting to find shelter in the wreckage of it. She grabbed a heavy wooden mallet, her only tool of defense, and climbed the ladder, signaling Silas to stay back. As she pushed the trapdoor open an inch, a gust of sub-zero air flooded the dugout, instantly turning her breath into a cloud of ice. Through the gap, she saw a ghost. It was Mr. Henderson, or what was left of him after 2 miles of trekking through a whiteout. He was slumped against a hay bale, his skin a translucent, waxy blue, and his horse was nowhere to be seen. He had likely lost the animal hours ago. Henderson's eyes were unfocused as he looked toward the source of the heat he could clearly feel rising from the floorboards. "Help me," he rasped, the words catching in his throat like gravel. I can't feel my hands, Clara. Please. The Clara didn't hesitate. The irony of his previous mockery flashed through her mind, but it was replaced by a pragmatic, community-minded urgency. She shoved the trapdoor fully open and called for Silas to help her. We have to pull him down, Silas. He won't last 10 minutes in the barn, she commanded. Together, mother and son reached through the opening, grabbing the heavy, frozen fabric of Henderson's coat. It was a grueling struggle to maneuver the larger man through the narrow opening, but the desperation of the moment gave them a frantic strength. They tumbled into the dugout in a heap of wool and frost, Henderson gasping as the sudden warmth hit his lungs like a physical blow. You're in the grave now, Henderson, Clara muttered with a grim irony, though her hands were already moving to strip his frozen gloves. Try to stay among the living while you're here. For the next several hours, the dugout transformed from a private sanctuary into a field hospital. Clara worked with a clinical precision, using lukewarm water and friction to bring the feeling back to Henderson's extremities. She avoided the temptation to use direct heat from the stove, knowing that such a shock could damage his frozen tissue. Silas moved about the small space, providing blankets and brewing a weak tea from their remaining herbs. Henderson lay on Silas's cot, his breathing ragged and shallow as the heat of the dugout began to thaw the ice in his beard. He looked around the room, his eyes moving over the sturdy cedar planks and the ingenious venting system. I saw the light from your barn vent, Henderson whispered, his voice cracking with shame and exhaustion. I thought it was a hallucination. I thought I was seeing the fires of the afterlife. Clara sat on a stool across from him, her expression unreadable. You called it a grave, Mr. Henderson. But the earth doesn't judge. It only protects those who have the sense to ask for its help, she said. Henderson closed his eyes, a single tear carving a path through the soot on his cheek. I told the others you were a fool, Clara, he admitted. I told them you were wasting your life in the dirt while we built our houses high and proud. Now their houses are sieves for the wind, and I'm the one begging for a spot in your dirt. Clara didn't offer a platitude. She simply checked the dampener on the stove and told him, rest now. We have enough wood, and we have enough air. But tomorrow, you will have to explain to the town why the woman in the hole is the only one with warm coffee. The technical reality of their situation was now more complex. They were 3 people and a dog in a space designed for 2, and their oxygen and fuel would deplete faster. The community had arrived at her door in its most broken form, and she was now the steward of their survival. The storm broke on the 7th day, leaving behind a world of blinding, pristine silence. When Clara finally managed to dig their way out through the barn doors, she found a landscape that had been rewritten by the wind. The homesteads in the valley were visible only by the thin wisps of smoke rising from their chimneys, many of which looked dangerously low. Henderson, weak but standing, walked out into the cold air and looked back at the barn. He saw the subtle signs of the dugout, the way the snow had melted slightly around the hidden vent, the lack of frost on the barn's lower timbers. It wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a living heart buried in the ribs of the earth. News of the widow's secret spread through the territory as the neighbors began to emerge from their frozen shells. They came to the barn not with laughter, but with a quiet, humbled curiosity. Clara welcomed them, showing them the construction techniques, the importance of the cedar lining, and the placement of the stove. She didn't hoard the knowledge as Miller had. The earth belongs to everyone, she told a group of gathered neighbors. If you build into it, it will hold you. If you fight it, it will break you. One neighbor asked, will you help us dig ours come spring, Clara? She nodded and said, Silas and I know the way of the clay now. We won't see another family freeze because of pride. The legacy of that winter wasn't the storm itself, but the shift in the community's philosophy. They learned that pride is a cold companion when the mercury drops, and that the most effective walls are sometimes the ones you cannot see. Years later, long after the barn had been replaced by a more modern structure, the dugout remained. It became a place of storytelling and a monument to the day a widow and her son taught a territory that survival isn't about standing above the world, but about finding your place within it. Clara would often sit at the top of the stairs in the quiet autumn evenings, looking at the smooth wood she had laid with her own hands, satisfied that her secret had become a foundation for everyone. Miller sought to escape the world, she whispered to Silas as they stood over the old trapdoor one final time. but we used the same earth to bind it back together.